An old man's knees buckled and he went down hard on the frozen sidewalk. His head cracked against the concrete. His cane spun into the gutter. People stepped around him. A woman in a business coat glanced down and kept walking. A man on his phone crossed to the other side of the street. Nobody stopped. Nobody knelt. The old man's hand clawed at the ice and his lips moved, but no sound came out. Then a wheelchair rolled off the curb and dropped into the freezing gutter beside him. Delia Marsh pulled off her coat and wrapped it around a stranger she had never met. Her service dog pressed against the man's chest to keep him breathing. She didn't know his name. She didn't know what he had been. So why did 2,000 bikers roll up to her door the next morning? Stay with me on this one. Let me back up, because you need to know who this woman was before the world came knocking. Delia Marsh was 34 years old, and she ran a little diner on Cedar Street in a town called Redwood Falls, Oregon. 12 stools at the counter, 4 booths by the window, a coffee pot that had been burning since before dawn for as long as anyone could remember. She opened that place herself every single day from a wheelchair. 6 years back, a truck ran a red light and folded her car around a telephone pole. The doctors saved her life. They couldn't save her legs. She spent 4 months in a hospital bed being told all the things she'd never do again. Run, dance, carry her own daughter up the stairs. Delia listened, and she nodded, and then she went home and figured out how to do almost everything anyway. She'd never once let anyone hear her complain. Not the nurses, not her neighbors, not the men who came to repossess her old van and left with it. That wasn't stubbornness exactly. It was just how she was built. She had a daughter, Josie, 9 years old, gap in her front teeth, crazy about horses she'd never once been allowed to ride. Josie's father left the year after the accident, packed a bag one night and said he wasn't built for this. Delia didn't chase him. She had a kid to feed and a diner to keep open, and no time to cry over a man who ran from a wheelchair. And she had Barrett. Barrett was her service dog. A big German shepherd, black and tan, 90 pounds of muscle and patience. He picked up the forks she dropped. He tugged doors open with a rope tied to the handle. He pushed her chair with his chest when the wheels bogged down in the snow. But mostly Barrett watched. He watched Delia the way you watch someone you would die for, and every regular in that diner knew it. Now here's the thing you have to understand about that winter. Delia was drowning. The diner was 3 months behind on its lease. The heater in the back had quit twice already, and she'd paid a man under the table to keep it limping along because a real repair cost more than she cleared in a week. There was a letter from the bank sitting on her kitchen table at home, and she hadn't opened it because she already knew what it said. Redwood Falls was a small town losing people every year. The mill had shut down 2 winters back. Half the storefronts on Cedar Street had paper over the windows, and a 12-stool diner run by a woman who couldn't rush the tables wasn't exactly a gold mine, but she never once let it show on that floor. Every morning she rolled in at 4:30, started the coffee, cracked the eggs, and greeted the early crowd by name. There was Walt, the retired mailman who took the second stool and the same 2 eggs over easy for 11 years. There was a young mother named Rosa who came in with a baby and no money more than once. And Delia always found a reason the meal was already paid for. There was a homeless man everyone called Pockets who slept behind the hardware store, and Delia handed him a hot coffee and a day-old muffin out the side door every single morning, rain or snow, and never made him feel like she was doing it. She'd slide it into his hands and start talking about the weather so he never had to say thank you. That was Delia. She didn't have much. She gave it away anyway. So on the morning this story really begins, it was maybe 11 degrees out and the sidewalks of Cedar Street were sheeted in ice. Delia was near the front window, refilling Walt's cup when she saw him. An old man across the street. Tall once, now bent. Long gray hair pulled back, a beard gone white, and over his shoulders a leather vest so faded and cracked it looked older than she was. He was walking slow, careful, one hand out for balance he didn't have. And then his boot hit a patch of black ice and he went down. She saw his head snap back. She saw it bounce off the concrete. And then she watched something that made her stomach turn over. She watched him lie there. And she watched the whole street decide he wasn't their problem. That's chapter 1, seen from the inside. Now let me tell you what she did about it. Delia didn't think. That's important. She didn't weigh it. She spun her chair around, shouted at Walt to call 911 and drove those wheels straight at the door. Barrett was already there, nosing it open with the rope. The cold hit her like a wall. She rolled off the curb and the front wheels dropped hard into the frozen gutter, and for one sickening second the whole chair nearly tipped. She grabbed the wheel rim, threw her weight and steadied it. Then she pushed through slush that soaked her sleeves to the elbow until she was right beside him. He was gray, not pale, gray. His lips had a blue tint and his eyes were half open and rolling, and there was blood already freezing in the gray hair above his ear. He was maybe 80 years old, and he was dying right there on the ground while a town walked around him. "Hey," Delia said. "Hey, look at me, I've got you, you hear me? I've got you." His hand found her wrist, cold as stone. And his other hand, she noticed, was clenched into a fist so tight the knuckles had gone white and he would not open it. Whatever was in that fist, he was holding it like it was the only thing keeping him tethered to the earth. She got her coat off. It wasn't easy from a chair, wrenching her arms back out of the sleeves, but she did it. And she leaned down as far as she could and tucked it around his chest and throat. It wasn't enough. She knew it wasn't enough. The cold was coming up out of the ground into him, and a coat couldn't stop that. So she did the only other thing she had. "Barrett," she said, "down on him. Now." And that dog, 90 pounds of him, lay down full length across the old man's chest and stomach, pressed his warm body against him and stayed. Delia held the man's frozen hand in both of hers and rubbed it and talked to him. She told him help was coming. She told him he was not going to die on the sidewalk. She told him her name and she asked for his, and he tried to answer, and all that came out was a wet whisper she couldn't make into words. People finally started gathering. A crowd of them now, phones out, some of them filming. Not one had knelt down before a woman in a wheelchair beat them all to it. Delia didn't look up at them. She didn't waste a breath being angry either. She kept her eyes on the old man's eyes, and she kept him there in the world one breath at a time. It felt like an hour. It was 9 minutes. Then the sirens. The paramedics came running, and there was a rush of hands and a stretcher and clipped, fast voices. One of them had to physically coax Barrett off the man's chest. As they lifted him, that clenched fist finally sagged open just enough, and something small and metal slipped out and hit the ice with a tiny clink. A dog tag. Old military dog tag on a beaded chain, worn so smooth you could barely read the name stamped into it. Delia picked it up before it could get kicked into the gutter, and she pressed it back into the old man's open palm and folded his fingers around it. His eyes came to her face then, really came to her, clear for just a second, and he squeezed her hand, that was all. Then they loaded him into the ambulance and the doors shut and it pulled away and he was gone. She sat there in the freezing gutter, soaked, no coat, shaking so hard her teeth clacked, and a stranger from the crowd finally draped a blanket over her and helped push her chair back up over the curb. She went inside. Walt had the door. Rosa had a towel. Somebody had refilled the coffee. Delia's hands wouldn't stop trembling for 20 minutes. She never got his name. She never learned which hospital. The medics were gone before she thought to ask, and she had a daughter to pick up and a diner that had emptied out and a floor slick with tracked-in slush. So she did what she always did. She got back to work. She mopped the floor herself, one long stretch at a time, leaning out of the chair. She wiped the counter. She flipped the sign and turned off the grill. Ordinary things. The things you do so you don't have to sit still and feel how close death had been, right there on the other side of your own front window. That evening she closed up alone like always. She counted a register that didn't have enough in it. She locked the door. She drove her modified van home through the dark and the cold to the little rented house on Fir Lane, and Josie met her at the door with a drawing of a horse, and Barrett flopped down by the heater vent like he'd earned it, and honestly, he had. Delia made grilled cheese. She helped Josie with spelling words. She looked at that unopened bank letter on the table and decided one more night she just couldn't. She put Josie to bed. She sat in the quiet for a while and thought about the old man and hoped he'd made it and figured she would probably never know. She even said a little prayer for him, a stranger, which she'd have felt silly admitting to anyone. Then she went to bed herself. And that, she thought, was the end of it. A hard day. A stranger she'd never see again. Just another cold night in a town that was slowly folding up around her. The house went quiet. The heater ticked. Outside, the snow kept falling on Fir Lane, soft and white and completely silent. She had no idea what was already coming down the highway toward her. It started around 7 the next morning as a hum, low under everything. Delia was at the kitchen table with her coffee, and at first she thought it was the furnace finally giving out for good. But it didn't stop. It grew. It rolled up out of the ground and into the walls until the coffee shivered in her cup and the window glass began to buzz. Then Josie ran in from the front room with her eyes huge. "Mama," she said. "Mama, come look. There's so many of them." Delia rolled to the window, pulled the curtain back, and her breath stopped in her chest. Fir Lane was full of motorcycles. Not 5, not 10. They were coming up the street 2 and 3 abreast, headlights on in the gray morning, and behind them were more, and behind those more still, a river of them stretching back past the corner and out of sight. Leather and chrome and grim, bearded faces. And every one of those men wore the same patch on his back. They were stopping, in front of her house. Engine after engine cutting off until the roar dropped to a rumble and then to an idle and then to a silence that was somehow worse. And here's what went through Delia's mind, and I want you to sit with it because it changes everything. She did not think this was a thank you. How could she? A wheelchair-bound single mother wakes up to 2,000 outlaw bikers filling her street, men who ride in a pack, men the whole town crossed the road to avoid. Her first thought, her only thought, was one cold word: trouble. She thought the old man had died. She thought these were his people, and they'd found out a stranger was the last one to touch him, and now they were here about it. Maybe they thought she'd taken something off him. Maybe they just wanted somebody to blame. She grabbed Josie and pushed her back toward the hall. "Go to your room," she said, and her voice was shaking. "Lock the door. Don't come out till I say." "Mama." "Go, baby, now." Josie went. Delia heard the lock click. And Delia Marsh, alone, 34 years old, no coat, no husband, no legs to run on, put her hands on her wheels and rolled herself to the front door to face whatever was on the other side of it. Because she wasn't the kind to hide, and she wasn't about to let it get anywhere near her little girl. Barrett stood at her side, hackles up, a low growl building in his chest. Delia took a breath. She opened the door. The cold poured in. And there, coming up her front walk through the snow, was one man. Huge. 60-something, silver in his beard, a face like carved rock, hands like a pair of catcher's mitts. The patch on his chest said President. Behind him, filling her yard, her street, her whole world, stood the rest of them. 2,000 men, and every single one of them went still when that door opened. Delia lifted her chin. "Whatever this is," she said, and her voice barely held, "my daughter is inside, so you deal with me and you leave her out of it." The big man stopped at the bottom of her ramp, and for a long moment he just looked at her, at the wheelchair, at the dog, at the mother with no coat guarding her door. And then this mountain of a man, this club president who'd probably never bowed to anything in his life, reached up, pulled the bandana off his head and held it against his chest. And every man behind him did the same. 2,000 heads bared to the cold at once. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice cracked right down the middle, "my name's Cutter. And the man you laid down in the ice for yesterday, the one you put your own coat on, the one your dog kept breathing." He had to stop. He swallowed hard. "That's Amos Rourke. He founded our club 41 years ago. He's the closest thing to a father half the men on this street ever had, including me." Delia's hand came up to her mouth. "He's alive," Cutter said. "He's alive because of you. The doctor said another 10 minutes on that ground and he'd have been gone. 10 minutes. And a whole town walked past him. Every one of them. Except you." That was the moment the fear drained out of Delia Marsh, and something else rushed in to fill the space. And she started to cry right there in her doorway. And she couldn't have told you if it was relief or joy or just the sheer overwhelming size of it. And that's the moment I'll ask you, if you're still with me, to hit that subscribe button, because the best part of this story is still coming, and you're going to want to be here for it. Because Cutter wasn't done. "There's something you need to understand," he said, "about who we are and what we don't forget. Amos raised us on one rule above all the others. You take care of the ones nobody else will. That's the whole code. That's it. He's been saying it for 40 years. And yesterday a stranger lived that rule better than any of us ever have. On the coldest morning of the year, from a wheelchair, for a man she'd never met and figured she'd never see again." He looked back at the sea of riders. "Word travels on the highway faster than you'd believe. By last night, every chapter in 3 states knew, and there wasn't a man among us who was going to let the sun come up without answering it." Delia wiped her face with the back of her hand. "You don't owe me anything," she said. "Anybody would have." "No," Cutter said, and his voice was iron now. "They wouldn't, that's the whole point. They didn't, you did." He climbed one step up her ramp. "So we had ourselves a meeting last night, every chapter. Men rode in from as far as Idaho in the dark, and the ice to be at that table. And we did some asking around this town about the woman who saved our founder. Took about an hour to hear the truth of it." Delia went cold in a different way. Her secrets. This town was small, everybody knew. "We heard about the diner," Cutter said quietly. 3 months behind. Bank letter you're scared to open. Heater held together with prayer. We heard you feed a homeless man out your side door every morning and never took a dime for it. We heard you comp meals for a young mother when your own register's coming up short. We heard about the husband who walked and how you never once badmouthed him where the girl could hear." He shook his head slowly. "You've been carrying this whole town on your back from a wheelchair and it's been letting you drown. Well, not anymore." He raised one hand and behind him men began to move. A truck. A flatbed truck that had been idling at the back of the pack came rolling forward, and on it was strapped a brand new commercial heating unit, still crated. Behind it, another truck. And another. Men were unloading kitchen equipment, a walk-in cooler, a new griddle, cases of supplies. "Some of the boys own contracting outfits," Cutter said. "Plumbers, electricians, HVAC. One of them builds ramps and accessible kitchens for a living. By the time we're done, that diner of yours is going to be the warmest, most wheelchair-friendly place in the state of Oregon. Counters you can reach, aisles you can turn in, every inch of it built around you, not in spite of you." He looked at her and his eyes were wet now too. "You shouldn't have to fight your own kitchen every day just to feed people. Not you, not after what you did." Delia was openly weeping now, both hands over her mouth, shaking her head like she could push it all back and make it not too much. Then a woman came forward out of the crowd, older, gray-haired, in her own leather. She climbed the ramp and knelt beside Delia's chair and took both her hands. "That bank letter," she said gently, It's already handled, sweetheart. The lease is paid current and it's paid a year ahead. We took a collection last night. Didn't ask anybody twice. She squeezed Delia's hands. You don't owe that bank another sleepless night. You hear me? It's done. Delia couldn't speak. She just gripped that woman's hands and cried, 40 years of somebody finally catching her instead of asking her to catch them. But that still wasn't the thing. That wasn't why 2,000 men rode through the night. Cutter stepped aside and he looked back down the walk and he said, loud enough to carry, "Bring him up." The crowd parted, and a van came forward, one of those medical transport vans, and the back opened, and a lift lowered down. And there, in a wheelchair of his own, wrapped in a heavy blanket, a bandage above his ear, pale but alive, sharp-eyed, was the old man from the ice, Amos Rourke, founding father of the largest motorcycle club in the region, and yesterday a nameless stranger dying in a gutter. 2,000 men went dead silent as his chair rolled up the walk toward her door. 2 chairs now facing each other in the snow. The woman who'd saved him, the man she'd saved, meeting really for the first time. For a moment neither of them said anything. Then Amos reached up with a hand that still trembled, and he opened his fingers, and there in his palm was that old military dog tag on its worn chain, the one he'd been holding so tight even death couldn't pry it loose. "You gave this back to me," he said. His voice was a rasp, but it was steady. "On the ice. I'd made my peace with going, and then a hand I didn't know put this back in mine and told me I wasn't dying on that sidewalk." He turned the tag over. "This belonged to my brother, Danny. We enlisted together at 19. He didn't come home. I've carried this 52 years. When I went down yesterday, all I could think was that they'd sweep it up with the road salt and it'd be gone, and the last piece of him would be gone with it." His eyes found hers and held. "You gave him back to me, and then you gave me back to my boys." He gestured behind him at the ocean of leather filling her street. "You have any idea what these men would have lost yesterday? Because of a woman, most of this town looks straight through." Delia leaned forward in her chair and did the only thing that made any sense. She took the old man's cold, shaking hand in both of hers, exactly the way she had on the ice, and she held it. "I'm just glad you're still here," she said. And Amos Rourke, who'd buried a brother and built a brotherhood and outlived nearly everyone he'd ever loved, put his head down and wept like a child while a single mother in a wheelchair held his hand on her front porch. Barrett, that 90-pound shepherd, walked slowly forward then and lay down across the old man's feet, the same as he had on the ice. And a low, broken sound went through the crowd of 2,000 hard men, the sound of grown men trying not to lose it all at once and failing. That's the payoff. That's what they came to give her. Not the trucks, not the money, though God knows she needed it. They came to bring her the man she'd saved so he could say the words to her face, so she'd know the size of what one act of kindness offered to a nobody in a gutter had actually been worth. The rest of that day, Fur Lane belonged to the bikers, and I mean that in the best way. They didn't leave. Not for hours. Cutter organized the whole thing like a general. The contractors got Delia's diner keys from her and were tearing out old fixtures by noon. A crew of them descended on her rented house on Fur Lane, patched the roof, replaced the busted heater she'd never even mentioned, stacked a winter's worth of firewood by the back door. Somebody produced a warm coat for Delia to replace the one she'd wrapped around Amos. A good one, lined, and Amos insisted on being the one to lay it over her shoulders himself. Josie finally came out of her room. She'd been peeking through the curtains the whole time, and when Delia called that it was safe, that little girl walked out onto a porch surrounded by 2,000 of the scariest-looking men in Oregon, and every one of them melted. One of them, a bear of a guy with tattoos up to his jaw, crouched down to her level and asked if she'd ever seen a motorcycle up close. Turned out Josie's love of horses had a new rival by sundown. They set her, with Delia's nervous permission and a helmet 3 sizes too big, on the front of a parked bike, and the whole street cheered, and Delia laughed so hard she cried again. Someone learned that Josie had never ridden the horses she was so crazy about, and by the next weekend that had quietly been arranged too. That was just how these men worked. They heard a need and they filled it, and they didn't make a speech about it. Amos stayed the longest. They wheeled the two of them side by side into Delia's little kitchen, out of the cold, and made them coffee, and those two sat at the table where a dreaded bank letter had sat unopened the night before, and they talked. About Danny. About the accident that took her legs. About the husband who ran. About how a man builds a family out of the ones the world throws away, and how that was, when you got right down to it, exactly what Delia had been doing her whole life without a patch on her back to show for it. "You're one of us," Amos told her. "You have been since before you ever laid eyes on me. You just didn't have anybody to tell you." He reached over and with great care pressed his brother's dog tag into her hand and closed her fingers around it, the exact gesture she'd made to him on the ice. "I want you to hold on to this a while. I've had it 52 years. I think Danny would like knowing it spent some time with somebody who understands what it's for." She tried to refuse. He wouldn't hear it, so she kept it. The diner reopened 11 days later. They'd renamed nothing, kept Delia's name over the door, but inside it was a different world. Wide, smooth aisles, lowered counters, a powerful new heater that would never quit on a cold morning again, and a small brass plaque by the register that Cutter had made without asking, and it read, "You take care of the ones nobody else will." Amos Rourke's 40-year rule hung on the wall of the woman who'd lived it better than any of them. Business, by the way, exploded. Turns out when a whole motorcycle club adopts your diner, and the story of what you did gets told at every gas station and roadhouse in 3 states, people come. They came from other towns just to eat at the counter where the woman in the wheelchair saved the old founder. Delia had to hire help. She hired Rosa, the young mother. She gave Pockets, the man from behind the hardware store, a warm job washing dishes and a reason to stand up straight again. Of course she did. That was always going to be how she'd spend it. Amos Rourke lived 3 more years. Good ones. He rode again, slower, in the back of the pack with a younger man's hand always near his shoulder, but he rode. And every Sunday morning of those 3 years, without fail, he was at Delia's counter, second stool from the end, 2 eggs over easy, holding court with whichever of his boys had come along, and looking at that plaque on the wall like it was the finest thing he'd ever built. When he passed, it was in his sleep at peace, in his own bed. And at his funeral, 2,000 bikes rolled slow through Redwood Falls behind the hearse, and at the very front of that procession, in a place of honor no one questioned for a second, rode a modified van carrying a woman in a wheelchair, her daughter, and a big black and tan shepherd with his nose to the glass. Delia still has the dog tag. It hangs behind the register now, next to the plaque, catching the light. And on cold mornings, when the ice comes back to Cedar Street, she keeps a special eye on that sidewalk out front, because you never know who's going to fall and you never know who everyone else is going to walk right past. She'll tell you she didn't do anything special that day. She'll tell you anybody would have stopped, but you and I know better. Nobody stopped. Nobody knelt. Except the one person who had every reason in the world to keep her own coat, and gave it away instead. And a whole brotherhood rode through the night to make sure she never once regretted it.